Hey there, welcome back to what is it called? Welcome back to Conscious Construction, the Conscious Enneagram podcast.
We did it.
I'm Abby Robbins.
I'm Kimberly Culbertson.
And today, we're not talking about types. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on the stances, or the Hornevian triads.
The Hornevian triads.
I particularly like calling them the Hornevian triads because it's a nod to Karen Horney, who was a child developmental psychologist, who actually talks about the kind of key piece, the key distinction between these three sets of types. And that is essentially how an individual will...
How an individual will interact with their environment in order to get their needs met.
Yes.
So you can actually find these terms outside of the Enneagram.
Yeah, so it's not just an Enneagram-specific thing, but we do see it very clearly in these three sets of three types. Right. And essentially the way Karen Horney set these things up is that you will either move towards your environment or your stimulus or a person, whatever it is. You will move away from the person, stimulus, environment, etc., or you will move against.
Yes.
And what we mean by against is you will take something and you will manipulate or change it to be something else.
Yep.
And so that relates to our three stances. The withdrawn stance moves away, the compliant stance moves towards, and the assertive stance moves against.
Yeah. One way that I like to talk about it is if you are not enjoying your current reality, what are you the most likely to do? So as an assertive type, if I don't like what's happening, I'm going to change it.
Yeah.
And I actually find it very confusing when people stay in situations that they don't like. Like, well, you have all these options to change it. Because that's my default.
Yeah.
And if you are in the withdrawing stance, then if you don't like what's going on, you're going to move away from it, either into yourself or out of the room. And then if you're in the compliant stance, you're going to crowdsource it a little bit. You're going to look for advice. You're going to look for a metric. How do I know how to get back to good?
Yeah. You know, I do think it's interesting the way that you phrase that around this idea of like, if you aren't enjoying it. And I think that might be like particularly 7 coming in, because this desire to make these moves, right, isn't necessarily based on something negative happening or not enjoying something. I think it is the way you will react to any stimulus, right? So it doesn't matter if it's good or it's bad. Like, case in point for a 7, if you experience something that's really, really good, what do you want to do? You want to take it and make it better.
Right, or just to have more of it.
Or have more of it, right?
Yeah.
Bigger, whatever.
Sure.
Where, you know, a 4 experiences something good and then shies away from it, right? Even if it is really good. It's not necessarily an uncomfortable situation. I think that this is really how we kind of habitually respond or move in like the dance of life, right? So you're, you know, letting someone else lead, you're leading, or you're stepping on people's toes. It's kind of like the dance equivalent to the different stances. So let's dive in a little bit deeper around each one. Let's start with both of ours least favorite, the withdrawn stance.
What? Least favorite? That's mean. Most confusing, maybe.
Yes, most confounding. I don't know though. I actually have a lot of people in my life who are withdrawn stance, and I love them dearly. But it is kind of like I don't understand you. I don't understand this movement towards the world.
Do you think the withdrawing type is harder for you to understand than the compliant type? Because I feel like an 8 might actually have like a harder struggle with the compliance because there's so much autonomy desire in the 8.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it and thinking about the people and the types that I struggle with most, I think they are probably more in the compliant type. So I struggle the most with compliant types. I'm the most confounded by withdrawn stances.
All right, okay.
We'll say, like, I generally like people in the withdrawn stance, but I don't get it. Like, I'm like, that's weird. Cool.
Okay, so let's talk about this thing that you don't get.
Yeah, let's talk about this thing that I really don't get. As an assertive type, I do not understand the withdrawn stance.
So let's talk about how the stances relate to the centers.
Yes, because that's helpful, and it makes things make a lot more sense.
Sure.
1 second. I'm talking very loud, so I just had to turn those down just a little bit. I give a smidge. So the stances relate to the center that is least developed,
right?
Or sometimes we might say repressed. For the assertive types, that is the heart center or the feeling center. So they have a lot of difficulty accessing feelings. They also tend to have a lot of trouble relating to people on a personal or more intimate way. Assertive types tend to objectify people a lot more often because we're not slowing down enough to experience feelings and experience the center where human connection happens. The withdrawn stance relates to repression of the body center.
Right. So
the least amount of access to the body, which really plays out like looking like not a lot of initiatory energy. These are people who generally don't like to take action. And it's not don't like, it's don't have the access or the energy to
it's
take
actually
action.
Physically harder to move toward something.
Yeah.
Regardless of how we feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the compliance stance is an underutilization of the thinking triad or the head triad,
right.
Which doesn't mean that you don't have thoughts. It means that they are unproductive.
Yeah, or you don't trust them as easily.
Yeah.
And so you're looking to outsource to other people's thoughts or to a metric that will help you, like, kind of hedge up your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting way of putting it. Like, you're outsourcing it to other people. And I think that is maybe the best description for all three, because often we look at the type 1 and we think, oh, they're not compliant. Like, they're rigid, they're stuck in their ways, they're not moving towards other people. But they're moving towards other people in a kind of like, I usually use the terminology that ones are kind of outsourcing their thinking to some sort of like rubric or moral standard or those sorts of things. And so it feels less personal. But the thing is, like, all of those things exist because of some other person farther away in the past.
Yeah, you've received your metrics from someone usually, if you're one, but you've also kind of vetted who gets to give you the metric or the advice or the right thinking.
Or it's almost depersonalized, I think, for a lot of ones, right? Like, we use the example of ones growing up in like evangelical culture a lot, because evangelical is a very, puritanical culture is very one-ish. I think evangelical is a little more three-ish. But we're not going to get into that.
It's a whole different podcast.
It's a whole different podcast. We're not going to get into it today. But
like religious fundamentalism is like, here's this set of rules. This is how we interpret these things.
Yeah. And now a little tiny baby one is getting that from their parents and their community. But it's presented as if it were disembodied, right? It's presented as, this isn't my thought. This is God's thoughts.
Right.
And so I think it can be difficult for ones to draw a clear line from like what they believe to where they heard it. Where for 2s and 6s, it's a lot more personal. Yeah. And so what they believe, I think maybe for 2s, it's the most personal. What they believe about the world and about themselves is very clearly kind of like an exchange with another person. Right. 6s have it more with other people, but they might also have it from like the news and, these other slightly disembodied experiences that are maybe less disembodied than, the whole of religion. Yeah. Like a text from, 3,000 years ago or however long, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, when we're talking about stances, I think it's worth talking about the anchor points.
Yes.
Because like we were just talking about the 6 is one of those on that center triangle. And they are, thinking first, but then they're also thinking repressed.
Yeah.
And so that puts them in the compliant stance. And so tell us a little bit about how that works.
So the phrasing that I like to use is that the dominant, for the anchor point, the dominant center is not available for personal use. And I got that from Peter O'Hanrahan. That sentence, I feel like, is the most succinct way of describing what happens through the anchor types. They're taking in the world through their dominant center, but they don't have access to respond to it from the dominant center, where if you look at the types on either side of each of the anchor types, you can see how they're taking in the information and immediately responding to it from the same center. So sixes are taking everything in through the head, but they're not actually able to respond from this very logical, analytical place. They're responding more out of the body center or out of the heart center. For nines in the withdrawn stance, body is dominant, body is repressed. So they're taking in the world through their gut.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But they don't have the access to respond from their gut. So they're responding to everything that they're taking in from either their head or their heart. Threes, they are heart dominant, heart repressed. So they're bringing in the world from this connected emotional space, but they're not responding from this connected emotional space. They're responding from the body or the head.
Yeah. Yeah, when I think about the threes, they're highly relationally attuned, especially to people's emotional response to them.
Yeah, but not
to their own.
Yeah, and not particularly relational. They're very relationally attuned, not particularly relational.
Yeah,
that might be a more succinct way of like getting to that piece. So we've talked about the compliance stance and kind of how the outsourcing of the thinking kind of gets put on other people, other situations.
Sure.
We started talking about the withdrawn stance. Let's dive a little bit more into the assertive stance.
Yeah, let's do it.
As we dance around our own types. Assertive stance is feeling repressed. How do you feel like that shows up for you?
You know, it was hard for me to see at first because I'm a very relational person. I'm a social 7.
Yeah.
And so I thought for sure I would end up in the heart center. And then as I started to study the Enneagram, I really started to realize I actually only know my emotions like in retrospect after I can think about them.
That's very interesting.
And so a couple of clues for me. One is that like my first reaction, the thing I struggle with first is anxiety, and then I might get to shame.
Yeah.
But like fear and anxiety, it like comes up right away into my body. And then I've done a lot of work, and so I have a lot of emotional language, but only about things that happened before.
Yeah.
And so once I've put it through my thought filter, I can say, I think I was feeling this way. But in the moment, I have no idea.
Yeah.
My face knows. People will tell me, like, you look really upset. And I'll be like, what? I'm not upset. And then, like, 20 minutes later, I'll be like, you know what this person said to me?
Pissed.
And then I have friends who will be like, I knew you were upset. And I didn't know that I was upset because I hadn't filtered it through yet in terms of the thinking.
Yeah. I think it's interesting for me in kind of contrast. I always know when I'm upset, right? But because I'm in the body center, everything comes out as anger. Right, so I can vibe with anger.
We're like absolutely reversed in that sense.
Yeah, because you're a 7 with a 6 wing as well, so it's like you're even farther from from the anger point. But for me, what I've noticed is that like also being in the emotional realness, like I've always been in touch with what I'm feeling in the moment, but I have like the emotional access and the emotional vocabulary of like a 4-year-old. Like legit. Like I'm stupid when it comes to emotions.
No, you're not.
Well, and I was, especially when I first started learning about myself, right? Like I had happy and I had angry. Through lots and lots of work, I had happy and sad and angry. And through years and years more work, I still have like happy, sad, and angry. Like my vocabulary for what I'm really feeling is very limited, and it takes a lot of energy for me to like peel back especially peel back the anger, because I like the anger. It's very generative. It moves me forward. It's emotional realness. It puts me in my body. Like, I feel it really deep. But that's it's not always. Sometimes I don't like saying that anger is always a secondary emotion, because that is not true. Sometimes anger is just what you're feeling. But if anger is your go-to all the time, it's likely covering up a lot of other things.
Right. It's like you don't want the vulnerability of all these other emotions on the emotion wheel. So we'll just slap anger on that.
Yes, exactly. Anger is the protective.
Yeah, it feels more protected. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like what it can look like for the assertive types. Yeah. Just the like lack of access to and lack of language around feelings. I'm like, oh, feelings. Yeah,
I think in terms of the assertive types, people think the 7 is the most surprising, even when it's not a social 7.
Yeah.
And I think that's because 7s can really come across as really easygoing.
Yeah.
And I don't know any 7s that would actually say they're easygoing.
Yeah.
Because you're always trying to move things around, move the pieces around until you get it to be like the thing that you want.
Yeah.
Even if you're not being honest with yourself about what you're doing.
Yeah.
No one who really knows me would call me easygoing.
Not at all.
People, if they come into a room and they don't know me, I create space really well.
Yeah.
I create moments of celebration really well. I can change the emotional landscape of a room.
Yeah.
And so and generally I'm doing that to make it happy. I'm like an emotional clown. Someone told me in a work environment, you're their emotional support animal. And I was like, well, you're not wrong. It's a little bit true. So
that's a little painful.
Yeah, well,
You're not wrong.
I've been called worse. But so from that angle, like the 7, because the 7 seems so fun-loving and chill, that's often masking, like, because the way we deal with anxiety is to plan and to do something fun and distract, that fun-loving is masking a lot of that head center anxiety.
This is really interesting, because what I'm seeing play out is that the 7 kind of stands apart in the assertive. The 1 kind of stands apart in the compliant, which we talked about, because they're not necessarily reaching out to moving towards other people.
Yeah,
necessarily.
If you're against their metric, they will not comply with you.
Yeah, no.
Right.
We say they're complying to their metric or their moral code or whatever it is. I'm having the realization now that the 4 also tends to stand out against the withdrawn stances, where 9 and 5 really do. They can very easily sink into the background and be kind of invisible.
And almost would prefer to fade back.
Yeah, 4s, while they definitely can do that, more often there is this like flair about them, like, because their desire is to be seen, and to be seen in a very specific and particular way. And those 3 types, 1, 7, and 4, are all idealist triad, like in the idealist triad. So they are connected. What? And so it's interesting that they stand out against their like stance cohort.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think 9s and 5s both have that quality where when they want to leave a party, they might do it and you wouldn't even notice for a while.
Yeah.
Like they don't really, whereas like a 4, when a 4 leaves a space, when a 4 is in a space, because they're bringing something very specific to it.
Yeah. And they're really cultivating that, and they're making sure, even if they don't, they want to be perceived and they also don't want to be perceived, like we talked about in the 4 episode.
Sure.
But they will make their presence known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. That idealist piece is like, I'm going to be thinking about that while I'm falling asleep tonight.
I'm also thinking about like 8, 5, and 2 and how those show up, because we also talked about the anchor types, right? So 3, 6, and 9s have this kind of interesting piece in relationship to their stance. And I'm curious what 8, 5s, and 2s. I mean, in some respect, 8s, 5s, and 2s they're actually called the relational triad. And in some respect, they are kind of the epitome of what we think about for each one of the stances. Like when you think about somebody who is compliant, you think about a 2.
Yeah.
Like the picture is of somebody who is very...
That's interesting.
Yeah, where somebody who is withdrawn, you think about somebody who is like a 5. When you think of somebody who is assertive or aggressive, you think of somebody, like the picture you conjure.
The 8 is definitely the poster child of the...
Exactly. So it's like we
types.
kind of have the poster childs for the stances in these, I believe they're either harmony or harmonic triads. I always get them mixed up. I don't know why there are 2 things that are so similarly named, but harmony and harmonic are actually different in the Enneagram. I think it's dumb. We need to find out a new name for these things. But 3, 6, and 9 on the anchor points, in some ways they're kind of like confounding the stance, right? Because they're dominant and repressed in the same center. The idealists kind of set themselves apart from the stance, and then the 8, 5s, and 2s, the relationalists, are like the poster child for the stance.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
It kind of makes sense because when you think of the stance being the way you interact with the world, then the ones that are relational are going to hit it the most.
Yeah.
Because that's about how you interact with people.
Yeah. And then the idealists are going to be kind of like on another level.
But it could be better.
Let me be withdrawn in this way. Interesting. Well, that was a fun little We're gonna have to like chew on that. If y'all have thoughts on that, please drop them in the comments below. I'd love to get some discussion started on this particular piece because this is, some chewy stuff.
Yeah. One thing that I will add, since we have a little bit of time, is that I think stances are one of the most helpful things to utilize when you are developing people or managing people. So if you're in a corporate space, and the Enneagram, it's not a perfect tool for the corporate world.
It's really not.
Because you're getting right into like your nitty-gritty hard things. You'd like take an assessment, now your boss knows your childhood wound. It can be like a little like, whoa,
did I
agree to this? But with stances, it can be really helpful, and you don't necessarily have to type people to kind of get a feel for which thing they're doing. You can just observe or even ask them, like, which thing do you think you'd be more likely to do? But if you know that you are, for example, I'm an assertive type, so I'm going to go right into whatever the thing is. But if I know that I'm working with someone who's withdrawing, then I know to kind of temper how fast I'm coming at them with something so that they have space to process, and even to like step away and then come back. Like, would you like some time to think about this, and then we'll schedule a meeting for next week to discuss? Whereas if someone did that for me, I would spend a whole week worrying and being upset, and I'll come back the next day like, can we just talk about it now, because I've overthought it for 24 hours, because I'm not a withdrawing type. And when you know your people are a compliant type, then that is really useful and a little dangerous sometimes, but they want to know what you think and what they need to do from your perspective. And so, and if you are a manager and you're a compliant type, you need to be aware of how much you care. Even when people below you are saying, well, you should be doing this, you should know, like, oh, I'm more likely to go along with that. And it can be just really, really useful in having that relational intelligence in how we are engaging with people as we're trying to train and develop them.
I think that's interesting because definitely in my client work, we're almost always moving to the repressed center first. Like that's the move for a lot of this work, that if like you're engaged in this personal development work, you are, you're definitely having to be much more keyed into working with assertive types. It's like, okay, well, let's pause and let's take some time to discover what the feeling is. If you're working with compliant types, it's like, okay, well, who said that? Like, is that your authority? Is that someone else's authority? Working with withdrawn types, literally the best thing you can do is movement. Getting them to actually move their bodies, wildly helpful. Even if we're not talking about like direct action on whatever issues they're bringing to the table, movement helps to facilitate that. That's very interesting. It's good stuff.
All right. Lots of fun in the stances.
Thanks you all for tuning in. My name is Abby Robbins. You can find all of my stuff at consciousenneagram.com.
And I'm Kimberly Culbertson. I'm one half of Kimberly and Coach. So you can find us at kimberlyandcoach.com. And we're also at that handle on Instagram. You can find us on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Be sure to click the like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, drop some comments down below about your stance and how you're relating to all this. So thanks again, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Cheers.